Just waiting for the stream to come on. Last time it didn't have anything on the YouTube app, so I don't know if this is working or not. But if you are here, thank you ever so much for joining me. It does appear that the stream is now on. I hope you guys have had a good week. I've had an extremely busy one. This is the first week officially that I've got back to work as a freelance web developer. I had my first big meeting, I guess, Monday. Say a meeting, it's kind of just going into the all day, speaking to developers there and so forth. That was really good. Obviously, as I'm off working on the house, I've also been doing other work and stuff and such that we'll be talking about in just a few minutes. But essentially, this is web development working week show that I do. Usually, it isn't live, but said in the previous couple of streams, has actually been purely because I haven't had the chance, the opportunity. So this is it. This is completely raw. So this week has been full of DevOpsy type stuff. So even though I'm a coder and I write code, I also do an awful lot of DevOpsy work, especially around Docker. And this week has been a week of trying to get things as quick and as speed or performant as possible, working on a rather large project. And we started adding opcache and memcache and other types of caching strategy, well, just to see how things would pan out. Very interesting results as well, I should say, primarily for that project developer. However, I do Python and too. So we the project we recently upgraded to PHP 7.1 enabled opcache, and it basically flew. Fantastic. I love opcache. However, you have to be very careful, and I did fall into this caching hole, if you will, where where I was testing on, it was an API, right? So I was testing the API response, and I did the typical developer thing of let's just turn something on, set it and forget it, and then come back to it the next day. And then forget that you've actually set this thing, and wonder why, pull your hair out for 2 hours straight trying to work out why on earth your data is actually ill. So that's the problem with caching, is things can get stale very quickly. And that was, of course, because I didn't have switch on opcache turned on, which revalidates the timestamps file system. That is extremely important if you are working in development. Not so important perhaps when you're in production, because when you're in production, your code itself isn't going to be changing all of the time. It shouldn't be, right? So it should change every time you do a release and a version. There might be some things that the code does dynamically that you want to be careful with when you do your caching, but primarily when you publish code, that code isn't going to change after it's gone to the server. However, when you're developing code, that of course is something that you are constantly changing, evolving, and when you refresh the page and you're like, why on earth is this not running? And it's because the flag wasn't set that would force a revalidation of the timestamp file system. Of course, there's other things that you can do to change that, so you can actually not only can you enforce that every request needs to be checked, but you can also tweak the time in which the file timestamps gets checked. So I did a bit of playing with that. But the thing is, and something that I'm quite passionate about, is that caching a website, caching data is fine. However, if something needs to be cached, I don't see the caching mechanism as the first thing that go to, primarily because usually what happens, or the usual things that I see, and I've been a freelance developer for numerous years. I've done all sorts of mistakes myself. A lot of it can be changed and made more efficient and more performant in the actual code. So yes, you can cache the responses. Yes, you can cache MySQL query and the results and all of that jazz. But actually, calling code needs to be or could be changed itself. So a lot of things. I mean, I'll give you some examples. Like loops, for example, is a killer, right? So if you're doing a lot of little bitty requests, big requests to say a database in a loop, then that is what I term as a death by a thousand cuts. Because yes, those queries might be really small, but suddenly, if your website has huge high volume of traffic, you're going to be doing those a lot. Uh, and not only traffic isn't the only driver here. It could also be just the volume of data that you have to sieve through in MySQL or whatever MySQL, I should say, or whatever data storage engine you're using. So analyze the code, and that was kind of something that I was drumming the beat with, just analyzing the code and seeing if we can actually find some quick wins in the code that doesn't force us to use caching. I think caching to a degree should be one of the last resorts, or a resort that you shouldn't be doing straight away. It should be the calling code. Just checking the stream. Yeah, hi guys. We've got study from South Africa, and we've got Munir from Algeria. Hello, hope you are all well and had good weeks. I hope you've had performing weeks as well, weeks where the code that you're running is quite smooth. Other issues that you can also fall into is well, let's just talk about that for loop, for example, and how you can get around that. So one thing you could do is, instead of doing several little queries, you could be doing a query in a batch, right? So thinking back to some project that I did a long time ago, I was sieving through like 20,000 records, which isn't a huge number, but what I found was the queries were just slowly becoming slower and slower and slower and slower. And what I ended up doing was, instead of doing a loop, we did an inquiry. So we created all of the things that we wanted to discover. So this was querying things by, I think it was ID. And we created an array of ID. Did that as a batch, one hit. So it's altering how MySQL gets touched, MySQL gets touched. And the more efficient code that you can create, the better the system will be. The problem with using caching is that things get stale very quickly, and it costs more money in developer time to install and monitor and manage caching systems than it is to actually either throw hardware at the problem, or to actually analyze the code and make it more efficient and refactor the code and get it in. So there's that. We also did, back in the day, I also did a lot of batching in terms of not only selecting but also transactional data. So this is where you're inserting a lot of stuff database. And if you can do that in a query that does a lot of things at once, then that is more efficient in a transaction. So let's say, for example, you're using Doctrine, like the ORM. You're persisting data in a loop. So you've got this big loop, say 50,000 things that you're looping through, persisting that. Well, every time you're using the ORM, you're actually putting things in memory. And you probably don't need to do that if you've got this script that you just want to populate a database. There's no need to have anything in memory. It just goes straight into the database, and there you go. So what you can do is call the flush, which is the actual creation of the transaction, right at the end of every do all your inserts. Basically, what you're doing is you're building up your insert statement. Then you do a flush right at the end. That is the thing that persists, or I shouldn't say that is the thing that saves it to the database. And if you've got a data set which is say 50,000, then use something like PHP array chunk, which is a way of chunking an array. You have an array of arrays, and basically loop through each set of arrays within that array. At the end of that set, you do a load of unsetting. So you possibly remove variables that you've stored in memory. And by doing so, you can actually put in 50,000 records extremely quickly into database using Doctrine ORM. Done that before. It took a long time to actually understand all of those things, and you will only sort of hit those errors, those issues, if you are using data sets of that size. Because of course, if you've got a data set which is only, say, 2,000 stuff, then it will go in no problem. But there are questions there. You've got to ensure that because you're removing it from memory, you're not actually doing any queries again on the data that you just inserted. You have to think about it as process, almost like a very procedural way. And a lot of the commands that we create, I create in Symfony commands, very procedural, very sort of Unix-like, where it's doing a very small thing and extremely well. Once that thing is done, memory gets removed, and the next thing, kind of like a recipe, sort of step-by-step basis. Other things include what else was I doing? I was doing all sorts of crazy, weird things with just changing the way the database queries work. Some of which you could do MySQL views as well. If you're hammering lots of tables because you're doing crazy amounts of left joins or right joins, inner joins, then it can just cripple the thing. So perhaps actually analyzing the data structure, seeing where the foreign keys should go, seeing where the indexes should go. The thing is with caching, like I said, people just see it as a silver bullet. I've actually done a video on why caching isn't the silver bullet, and it does trip people up. Now, I spent a good few hours today trying to pull my hair out, wondering why on earth something wasn't working because opcache wasn't configured correctly. It was working perfectly fine in a sort of a semi-production environment, but it wasn't working fine in development environment. Therefore, what I ended up doing was splitting out the configuration. So it was development configuration and production. And I was tweaking the config, allow me to actually develop the site, the application, without caching getting in the way, but ensuring that caching was still there in development, because you want to ensure that you are testing in a close-ish environment that you set up to say in production. And in production, when you're playing with things like Mcache, that again is something that piece of infrastructure that you set up. It's a server that you have to set up, you have to monitor, you have to secure, you have to do all sorts of crazy and wacky things to it. So you want to ensure that you are kind of working with that similar infrastructure in development that you're using in production. Maybe on a smaller scale, obviously, but if you're just completely blind to how production is set up and you are just working in a development environment, and then you're wondering why it doesn't work in production, because your integration tests, because your testing of the integration doesn't match what is actually in production, and that is an issue. Fortunately, programmers, it's the time it takes. Now, 2 hours were lost today, probably more. And it was as simple as changing a 0.1 opcache configuration, where it was changing the validate of the file timestamps. I didn't know, I knew of that, but I had forgotten of it. So it wasn't something that I first went to. And of course, typically as a software developer, I was looking for a complicated solution to what I thought was a complicated problem, when in actual fact it was an extremely simple issue. All I had to do was just change the configuration line. Okay, just checking some of the questions. Hello, Enter 3 Negma. I hope you're well. And hello, Monoj from India. I hope you're also well. So Monoj has asked, does persistent data always exist in cache? Very, very good question. It can do. So it can do, but you have the ability as a developer to set that configuration. So yes, you can set it and forget it. And in some cases, that is correct. So for example, there are data that I would play with that will just never change. So for example, currencies, or not currencies, sorry, that's a silly example. So like languages and countries, perhaps even towns and cities. So they change extremely infrequently, right? So the word English never changes, right? Because it's English, same as Polish, same as Indian, right? So though, if you had, for example, a drop down list of all of those things, and they were being populated by a database, so every time you landed on that page, you have to do a database call just to get all of the language. So for example, ES is Spanish, EN is English. Again, that doesn't change very often, does it? So if you were doing a database call to fetch that stuff, then yes, you would want to persist that in memory, in cache. You don't want to be changing it all of the time. However, there are things that you have to decide how long things are going to be stored for, how long things will be cached for. You usually give a time in seconds how long things can live. And this is the hiccup that a lot of developers get into, including myself, where you assume that it's going to be around for a while, and then someone changes something in the back end, and then you have to invalidate that cache. So that's the point. If you are getting something that is from a data source, and that data source changes frequently, then you want to ensure that when that changes, the cache gets invalidated. Therefore, when you go and try and get that information again, first of all, what it's going to do is say, is it in the cache? It's going to say, no, it's not in the cache. Then it's going to get that from the database, save it to the cache, and what you usually do is you memcache example, you set a key, so it's like a key value pair. So memcache uses strings, so you can store strings and stuff. So if it was an object, you would serialize that, save that in cache against the key. Next time it gets searched for, it will say, does this key exist? Cache will go, yes, it does. Here it is, completely bypassing the database. But when the cache, when the data itself physically changes, you then need to remove or flushing, call it pruning, remove that value and key from the cache, because the next request that comes along will say, is the cache there? And then the cache will go, no, it doesn't exist. And that's how the cache basically builds upon it. I hope that kind of helped. Hello, Hongan. I hope you are well. I'm just going to grab some tea. I am thirsty. I hope I'm sounding all right, because this room is extremely echoey. But yeah, that's basically what I've been playing with this week. Well, I say this week, it's been 3 days, so basically hard at it. Dropped in the deep end this week with playing with some caching. There's lots of challenges with this stuff, but that's pretty much it. In the evenings, I've been doing a lot of stuff on the howtocodewell.net website. So that is, I've got loads of ideas that I want to do with that. And you may have, if you go on it, you may have noticed that it's going down, going up. That's basically changing. I want to get some sort of static status page on that. Just when it goes down, there is something there. But I've been playing with SSL, and I've been playing with databases and configuration. I've been creating some tests for that because I don't want this to be a project that I just kind of like monitor. I want to actually work on it. At the end of the day, the platform that I wish to build, put all of my programming tutorials on, as well as here on YouTube, other places, and sort of build sort of a community vibe from that. So yeah, I've been playing with it. I've got a whole list of things that I want to do, but the move of in this, because I've recently moved house to this place. This is just a spare room here. There is a lot of things that I need to set up. I need to set up a Jenkins server. I need to set up a file server. I need to alter my backup server to be a better backup server. Lots of things that are still perhaps in boxes that I need to adjust and sort out. I just haven't sort of had the chance or the opportunity to do that because obviously when you move house, you've got all sorts of other things that you need to be worrying about, or not worrying about. You've got to do like painting and decorating, drilling holes and filling holes and all that stuff. So I just haven't had the opportunity to do that. However, with the Jenkins at least, so how I set up Jenkins, I do it in Docker. I perhaps have Docker slaves in other, sorry, Jenkins slaves in Docker containers in other boxes. Think of it like almost like a swarm. You've got Jenkins master that can control the different slaves um, as a build tool. So, for example, the idea being that as a freelancer, I don't really want everything on the same Jenkins master. I want to have its own specific slave for projects. People say that I go a little bit too far because obviously with these projects, big projects that I've got, they have their own Jenkins boxes off the cloud and stuff, which is fine. But I personally like to have my own stuff here as well, because if I was ever asked to monitor and alter and change and upgrade servers on the net, then I'm playing with servers down here first, similar setup. Because obviously with production, you have to wear kiddie gloves because you don't want to break anything. So yeah, that's what I kind of want to do. I want to put some better lighting in here, sort of sort out the sound in here. Plus, I'm also developing a Python course as well for Pax publishing, something that I've been about for a while. So I'm still working on that. The sound in this room is pretty awful, as you can probably tell. So I'm also trying to sort that out in post edit, which is taking an awful lot of time. So I don't know. There is a lot of things. I've just been asked by Monjo on the stream, which one is better, Docker Swarm or I'm guessing K8? Do you mean Kubernetes? Right. That is that is a very open question. Which one is better? So I've been using both. In fact, I've been using Kubernetes more recently than I've been using Docker Swarm. I started with Docker Swarm, and it was fine. I used that on some projects that were they were using sort of small VPSs on the web, obviously, and you could, with the Docker drivers, you could actually use those to communicate to the Docker machines that were in the Docker Swarm extremely well, and that is something that I really liked. Just the ingrainedness with Docker, as you can probably tell. Me doing a Docker course with Manning Publications. I've actually got a course which is like 5.5 hours long, which just teaches the basics of Docker. I am a Docker fanboy. I love it. I love Docker. It's changed the way I have worked as a developer. And it's also changed the way teams have worked that I've worked for. I've got teams on Docker, how they do things on a daily basis, which is fantastic. I love it. But Kubernetes is perhaps another beast and should be seen as another beast. yes, you can get a little bit more nitty-gritty with it. You have to ask yourself, though, is there any need for that? So you can get really ingrained to perhaps the, uh, the actual configuration of the infrastructure that you're setting up. And it uses a different sort of language, if you will. I guess that's the right term. So it uses pods and so forth to actually set up these things. Whereas with Docker machines or Docker Swarm, you have the so forth stack and that jazz. So there is a level of divergence. You have to be careful with that when you are a developer, because essentially what you're doing, think of it like you're walking down of you're on a raft, got one foot in one raft and another foot on another raft, and slowly diverge, right? You have to be careful with that. My question back to that is, are the benefits of Kubernetes worth it for the project you're doing, you're using, you're creating? Docker Swarm would be my default. Why? Because Docker, right? It's like, why would you use another WordPress process? You're using Windows. Just use Word. Why would you choose to use something else? And that's your diversions. So with Kubernetes, you have to be cautious that it could go in a completely different direction that Docker is in. However, Docker is embracing Kubernetes, and that is the flip of that argument. Kubernetes, I mean, Docker for Mac, the application that I use to access Docker on my Mac here, that has Kubernetes inside. So they are kind of in bed together. Okay, so I've just been asked, can you suggest any resources and gear up in Docker? That was from Manjo. Can you suggest me any resources to get up? Well, do you mean learning resources? Because if you want to learn Docker, then I can just signpost you to my Docker courses that I have a 2 and a bit hour course here on YouTube, and I've got a 5.5 hour course on from Manning Publications. So yeah, but in terms of hardware, because I'm not too sure what that question means. If you're talking about what hardware to use in terms of the resources, then I am very keen on things like Linode, Docker, DigitalOcean. They are very on it when it comes to these technologies. I've also been using AWS. Now, the reason why I split off AWS from the other two is simply because of cost. AWS is very pricey. It's very, very pricey. It kind of it's sold as it's not. It's very cheap. But the thing is, if you do something wrong, then it is quite costly. Or if you're trying to scale, then it can be quite costly because of West and so forth. The issue that I've had recently with Docker, grab some more. So the issue that I've had recently with Docker is SSL certificate. Because there are loads of ways to skin a cat. There's loads of ways to do it. There's too many ways to do it. So one way is using a proxy. So you could use an Nginx web server that proxies requests web server are actually on, which is fine. You put in the SSL certificate on the proxy server. That proxy server will then proxy back to whatever web server that you're communicating, which is fine, which is perfectly fine. Problem though comes when you're deciding how you're going to set this up, because you could create a container that just handles your certificates being renewed. So here I'm talking about, excuse me, Let's Encrypt. So if you don't know, Let's Encrypt is this fantastic way oh, sorry, just having a look at the comments. Manjo said, I meant for learning. I tell you what, I will put a link in the description in the video down here where I talk about, with links to the courses that I'm talking about. And do check out Manning as well, because they have loads of other bits and pieces. But certificates for Docker, in terms of Let's Encrypt stuff, you've got to be careful because it has a what tip of my tongue. It's do they call it retakes? It's like a request limit, so you can only request a certificate created. I think they have like a limit. It's a request limit. And of course, if you are using Docker Compose as a way of tearing down your infrastructure and bringing it back up again, then you risk issuing another certificate. So how many times do you deploy a day, right? So you need to ensure that on your very last deployment, you're not going to hit that threshold of issuing a certificate. So you need to set up your volumes extremely carefully to ensure that when a certificate is built and has been created, it doesn't get recreated. So I've been creating some scripts to detect whether that certificate has been there, and if it is there, leave it alone. If it expires, remove it and then request another. So it is a bit problematic. Plus, when you're using the reverse proxies, a lot of time people just go, right, I'm going to put the HTTPS stuff right at the right at the top, so on the proxy layer. So any public requests going in will be HTTPS. However, the actual servers that we're reverse proxying to are just going to be HTTP. Now, a lot of people are like, no, that's not an issue, but it is an issue if you've got someone doing something very naughty in your network, because the traffic within the network is HTML, is HTTP. So you've gone and taken an encrypted thing. Yes, I guess it is encrypted still because it's down. But what I like, kind of the belt and braces, I kind of question the fact why is it that we just keep the certificates just for the public? Why not create some certificates again? Because for the servers, because you could be talking to all sorts of things. And there are issues where you've got CORS, which is cross origin requests, where something that you're pulling down from isn't in HTTPS. So it gets a bit issue. Heated pillow. Yes, this is the new office. This white thing. New office. This isn't the new office that is yet to be built. This is a temporary office because I don't want to give to it might not happen, so I don't want to talk about the new office that I'm intending on literally building, but just because that might not happen. But this is only supposed to be temporary, but take that with a pinch of salt, because I'll probably still be here by the end of the year, which probably means that this stuff is going to be changed because it's a bit boring and bland. But hey ho. So yeah, Docker. That's what I've been playing with. A lot of Docker, a lot of caching. There has been only code to test the caching mechanism this week, unfortunately. So I did a lot of stuff like creating controllers in Symfony where you would be incrementing numbers. So you would be putting a number into cache, pulling it out of cache, incrementing it, putting it back into cache. Every time you refresh the page, the number would, just to ensure that the caching worked. Opcache, like I said, is more bytecode caching. Or if I said that, but that is that's a different ball game, and that you have to ensure that the configuration is set up correctly, especially if you've got that turned on and you're in development mode. because you want to be careful with timestamps file system. So caching hole that I got myself into was, why on earth is this controller, this response of this API exactly the same every time I press refresh, and yet I can pull something from the database that has changed, and that gets but it's the actual physical code, Why is that not changed? That was because I didn't adjust setting of the timestamp. So the file system not being checked, or a change of the actual controller code. Another question from Heated Pillow. Oh, not question. Love Docker, by the way. Yeah, Docker is awesome. That's all I'm going to say on that matter. Docker is, it has. So I've been a developer for, what? Well, I've been working in the professional world, I guess, like 13 years. I was a developer before that for like 6 years, studying and so forth. And I was a freelancer before that, working on, and I always had a problem with working on multiple projects. That was always the issue, because settings would just be completely different. Docker has literally changed that, and it has changed everything I do. So I've got a video that I was working on last weekend, where I talk about the tools that I use on a frequent basis. Docker is in there, and so is the terminal. They are the first two things that I actually use on any project. So instead of opening up my IDE, I open up my terminal window and I start a Docker machine. Then I open up my IDE, because you are isolating and segregating your development environment with all of the other projects. And it has been a complete game changer, especially for a freelancer who's working on crazy projects, lots of crazy projects, kind of on the same sort of level. And you don't want to be adjusting PHP values, PHP INI, you don't want to be adjusting opcache INI values, you don't want to be altering how the data base, the versions of that, because if you're doing that without Docker, then you're changing it for everything. It's kind of a global setting that you're setting. So one thing when I got the Mac here, yes, I will actually. Sorry, I'm rambling now. Manjo has asked if I could share the links. I'm just going to grab that now. Let's just bear with me a minute, guys. Yeah, so what I was saying was Docker has literally changed everything that I do. It's made my life a lot easier. It's made actually developing a lot funner, better, because you can replicate how things are actually going to be in the future. Sorry, let's. I think I've got all of these. So this here is Docker in Mobile. So this is from Manning Publications. So I'll put that in the comments. Also, going to just put this in description. Bear with me. Yeah. So that's my Docker in Motion course. It's like 5.5 hours long, about 5 hours, 20 minutes long. It goes through all sorts of things very basic stuff to begin with, and then it moves into volumes, creating volumes. It moves into bind mounting, persisting data. It talks about Docker Compose. We build together two Docker files. One is the database, and one is the web server. And I created an application for this, and I will share that now. So this is this is Docker, and dockerinmotion.com is the website that we actually build in the course. So it's basically a list of people, and you can add and you can edit and you can remove those people system. You'll also there's a discount code on there too that you can. So you need to have a way of linking both the database and the web server container together. So we talk about that. We talk about networks. We talk about how a Docker image is actually created. So with the Docker images, it uses Docker layers, and each layer gets cached. So you can create a Docker file in a very inefficient or efficient way. So I talk about all of that. I talk about security good practices. I talk about the accessing the Docker history, inspecting all of your containers. I talk about how you can clear your containers down. Basically, a whole sort of the fundamentals of Docker I touch on. And it gets to the point where we now have, it goes on to creating the web server and the database here. And we do that through the command line. Then afterwards, we create a Docker Compose file, and that file you can use to spin up and spin down, build, so forth. There is a forum as well that is pretty active, so do check that out because there has been updates and changes and stuff. So I would recommend checking out that forum on the Manning site. And oh yes, you. So it's a video course. I should have mentioned that, but it's kind of like it's done in a book. Everything is transcoded, as in it's all transcribed. My voice is see it in text, right hand side of the player. So everything I say, you'll see highlighted, and what you can do is click on the text, and it back to the point in the video. There's also there's 150 exercises as well, which are multiple choice questions just to keep you on your toes. There is a couple of trick questions in there to make sure that you have been listening. But yeah, it's basically has been a labor of love for me past for a while now. And it's kind of like I found Docker something that had completely changed the way I develop, and I wanted to share that knowledge. It was it answered a lot of questions, made developing a lot easier, and I would like to pass that on to developers. And I was thrilled to bits when Manning got in touch, said, "Do you want to do this course?" And now I'm doing a Python course for Pact Publishing as well. I'm going to be talking about that in depth and probably do a announcement video of that when that is closer to being ready. But it's a Python course, and yeah, it's I just like teaching. I like teaching. So this week, even though it's been short, it's only been 3 days, has been quite busy. So the next few days, I'm writing. I need to write some unit tests to ensure it actually came to fruition, and had worked. I've basically got this running on my development machine here, and tomorrow and the next day, I'm going to be looking at pushing this staging, all of these changes, duration, tests and checks. One thing I should say about unit tests and functional tests, acceptance tests, is do them. They are a pain in the ass to do, but please do them because they have saved my bacon the last few days. Where so there was obviously this break between me getting sorting this house out, and then me going back to work. Well, so I do like doing my tests. I'm kind of an advocate of testing, but at the last week it was a bit of a mad rush, right? So I didn't test everything that I created. I don't test it. That's nobody does, but you test the important parts. That's the point. So I got into an issue where something wasn't working, because I hadn't put the test in. So I wrote the test to ensure that the test failed. Then I found the problem error logs because the test got the error. So it was a repeatable problem. This is the problem when you're working on different platforms, whether it's development or staging or production. Even though you're using Docker and containers, even though everything is very similar, there are changes to the configuration, and that usually throws errors. So by having these unit tests, it was actually an acceptance test, is actually very beneficial. And the simplest acceptance test is just to check if the responses are 200 okay. So imagine you've got a website that has thousands of pages. Then what you could do is create a sitemap, like your XML sitemap that we just published to Google, and you could loop through that in a script and just touch, sure that each of those pages are returning with 200 OK. If it isn't, then you've got an error. But just imagine having to do that all manually every time you do a deployment. Crazy. So there are all sorts of websites that I see that certain pages just fail, and you know that it's probably a very small issue, but you know it's one of those pages that is like really embedded and deep ingrained in the website. So it's kind of like a very infrequent page to access. Therefore, it's a very infrequent page to test. I'll tell you why my bacon was saved. Because before I went on leave, to sort this house out, I upgraded a project using Symfony. Luckily, it never actually went to production. I refused it going to production before I went on holiday, just because. Let's not push code on a Friday evening. That's a bad idea. So I upgraded Symfony, and of course, I upgraded all the dependencies of Symfony. One being Twig. Twig had changed in the latest version. I think it was, from memory, it was the raw function. So they removed it. I think they removed it. And so this page just never ran. It was throwing a 500. But because I didn't do a test, I wasn't aware of that until I actually got back. And so what I ended up doing was writing a test for that particular page, but also doing what I said, creating a script that goes through all the pages, and then just checking they were too. Because especially if you're changing and upgrading a framework, something that is integral to the application, which changes and touches every single thing in that application, you want to be making sure that every page works. So, yeah, lesson learned there. Heated Pillow, do you unit test as a freelancer? Does clients understand? Oh, that's a very interesting question. So Heated Pillow has asked, do you test as a freelancer, and do clients understand and pay for them? So, okay, so I take the stance that testing isn't an additional. This is quite a controversial answer. I feel there's a lot of developers that don't test because it takes time, and therefore, as a freelancer, where you are paid for time, the time and the experience that you offer within that time, you often try and cut as many corners as possible to get the product done, get paid in the time allocated. However, that is not my work ethic. What I do. So there's been in the past, there's been conversations I've had with clients where it's taken me a lot longer to do than I had first said, but it's ended up being more stable. And I took that on the chin. I took the time hit on the chin. They didn't pay for that. That was time that I did. But Now I am at a point where I can see, or I can try and estimate a little bit better as to how long it's going to take me to test. Now, the problem here is TDD. Well, it's not a problem. TDD. So this is where you're testing before you're actually writing code. So you create a failing test and create the code that fixes the test, which is fine. However, you don't, as a freelancer, want to be doing that all the time, because when it comes to showing your client what you've done, like if they have like these incremental, you don't want to say, oh, I've just written 500 failing tests, but I can't show you any code. I can't show you anything working. But I've got the tests to prove for me that it will be working once those tests are fixed, once the code has been written. So yeah, you've got to be very careful. I do a lot of my testing after I've done the development. Isn't ideal. There are some times where I do the testing before I do the development, but I see it as not a separate thing to coding. Testing, for me as a programmer, is something that we just have to do. It's a responsibility on us as programmers to test what we do. Because often when we write code, we leave the code and it gets managed by someone else. So you're picking up somebody else's code. And as a programmer, I want to know that I can run tests of a previous developer's code that work. That fills me full of confidence that I'm not just working on stuff that I don't know works. Because without those tests, I've got nothing to prove to me that it works. Yes, you could just click about on a web page, fine. But does that work in every browser? Does that work in every instance of every account? Maybe an account is in a different state, It's a problem with legacy. But personally, I see testing as something that isn't separate from actually. I work extremely late, so I do just for my sake like to write tests just to reassure myself. The amount of times that I've actually saved, and this is another thing, there is a misconception that writing tests is something that wastes time. It's not, because it actually saves time. Because often if you can't write a test for what you've created, then what you've created needs to be refactored. So you can use testing as a way of analyzing your own code. So for example, with unit tests, you're only testing a unit of work, a small unit of measure. So you shouldn't be injecting all sorts of crazy stuff. And you could end up in the problem where you're mocking all of your objects. But the more mocks you have, the more coupled your code. So what I often find is that if I can't test something easily, then I often refactor the code to make it test easy. And doing so reduces the amount of code that I've got, reduces the amount of testing that I've got. You end up with lots of tests, right? And it is a problem when it comes to if you do a broad sweeping change, you have to change all of the tests as well. Fine, agree. But it is actually, in my opinion, can be used as a saving of time, because you're aware of the problems before those problems become an issue. So for and it goes hand in hand when you are clued up on design principles for perhaps object orientated programming, right? So you can write code in of a very object orientated way, which in some instances can be easier to test if you're using design patterns such as the adapter pattern, interfaces, all of that kind of jazz, decorator pattern, all of that, command pattern, and so forth, whatever. There's loads of design patterns. Go read the book, the Solid Principles book by Robert Martin. Very good book. And yeah, so I see testing as something that we just have to do. I I don't explain to so okay, so the other part of that question is, does the client understand the tests? I don't think the client needs to understand the test, right? Because let's say, for example, you're an electrician and you go in and you put you before you do any work, you obviously have to check that the electrics aren't live, so you turn the board off. But you also do crazy things like testing whether or not you're drilling into a hole, drilling into a wire. When when it's all wired up, ready to go, you can actually test to see if the socket is working. So you have a device that you stick in. Go. These are things that I'm not a I as a just a general consumer of electricity, I don't know um, what they're doing, but I expect them to do it the same as my clients expect me to test the code that I write. I had a bit of a disagreement with one programmer, one freelancer, who said that they would charge extra to test the code that they wrote, and I thought that's quite a very negative way of programming, because it's a very business oriented way of programming. It's kind of like I'll give you half of the stuff, but I'm not going to tell you if it works or not. Even I don't even know myself if it works or not. But if you want me to check that it works, then I'm going to have to charge you more. And I just thought, no, because if he has that attitude to testing, what other things is he going to have that attitude with? So, yeah, it's a difficult one. One thing I will say though, before we get off the topic of testing, I'm not explaining this very well, I doubt, is that you should only be testing the things that need to be tested. So a lot of people waste their time, and myself included, when I started learning about testing. Test everything. I like graphs and charts and spreadsheets. Okay? I like to have colors that I can see a visual representation of code coverage. So I used is it Clover PHP on Jenkins to test and analyze the code coverage, and it was coming up with all sorts of crazy and wonderful functions, mostly getters and setters, that were just complete sort of like 3 lines of code. And they were, here's a value, and then that value gets set to that property in that object. The whole object gets returned. Fine. Or the getter is get me that value, and that's it. Do you have to test all of those things? No, not necessarily. They aren't as a priority for me than the actual things using whatever that is. Yes, if you go and change the way those getters and setters behave, so they're not as simple as they perhaps should be, then yes, you test those. Although I'm going to completely contradict myself now. So there was one project I did recently. I think it was probably early this year, where I was working on it whilst I was on the train to another client. So I had no Wi-Fi, I had no internet access, and and the train journey was like an hour or so long. So I was working on that project in a very closed environment, and it would come to like the evening, and I would come home, that I could actually get on the internet, actually continue that work. So what I ended up doing is I created a series of entities, because I didn't have the tools to download Docker images for the database. But I created the entities in Doctrine, and which kind of hung the objects together, um, and then that I could display those in the pages and stuff, the data in the pages and stuff. But I used unit testing, to ensure that the entities were actually hanging together correctly. So I took it from a controller's point of view. I tried to test the output of the controller, but going through the. So I ended up in that project with far more unit tests than I would normally have in a normal standard project. But that, for me, was a priority at the time. Because I didn't have the access to the internet, I couldn't download the MySQL database, right? MySQL, could be Mongo or whatever. But I wanted to come up with the structure, the schema, if you will, of the data storage. And in order for me to test my the hanging together of all of those objects, I did create a whole raft of unit tests, because I found, like, I was going to this client on the train for a long time, so I was using that morning commute as an opportunity to actually write code. And I was finding that I was being able to write hundreds of lines of code in that small pocket of time, sometimes on the way back. But I never had a way of testing and checking. So I never had something that you could just refresh the page on, display the page, because I wanted to get the infrastructure, the database stuff sorted before I got to that point. So I only wanted to manage the code, because the thing is, when you start working on the interfaces, the actual GUIs of things, designing and all that stuff, your head gets, what I find, my mind moves from actually structuring objects, making the page look good. That is a hole that you can fall into. And then, because I was working, I was obviously working for another client during the day, my head was not in the game. So when I got back home, I was still thinking about the client that I was working with all that day, not the project. So very easy to just sort of drop the balls and stuff. So it's kind of like spinning a lot of plates, but trying to do it in the most. This is kind of a very long-winded talk on testing. Perhaps I'll do a video on it, and I'll give you examples, some tutorials perhaps on how I test. Everyone tests slightly differently. I use Codeception a lot. I love it. I do a lot of Symfony work. I've done a lot of Laravel work as well, and I find that Codeception is just a very good way of testing. Anyway, I've taken up far too much of your time. It's been an hour and 2 minutes already, but thanks ever so much for the great questions, and happy coding. I will see you again soon. Before I go, if you're new here, please do like, subscribe, and all of that jazz. I will see you some other point. Cheers. Bye.